Hi everybody, it's Mrs. Carly. Today I wanted to talk to you about the very important business of play. So I do have notes because, again, I don't want to forget things, and I always think of these wonderful things I want to tell you all and then I forget about them. So I do have my notes, so you'll see me referencing those at different times. So I get a lot of questions from not just parents but people in the community, and it's like, well, pre-K, what do you do all day? Just play? And the short answer is yes, absolutely. And the reason that that is the case is because play is the absolutely most important thing to children. Um, I remember listening one time to a speaker. She was talking about how whenever we interrupt a child's play, you might notice that they get screamy and upset, but to them, that is the most important thing they're doing. And even though we're saying, okay, well, it's important, you have to eat your dinner now and you have to do this and that and the other, the child is thinking that what they're doing is truly important. And they're right, it is truly important. So to mitigate that, I would say, just to give them a few minute warning, say, hey, we're gonna have to stop playing here in however many minutes. For really young children, maybe use a visual timer. I have one in my classroom that I use. It's red, and then as the time goes away on it, it makes the red gets less and less, and then it dings. And my students have started figuring that out, and whenever there are like 30 seconds left, they're like, oh, let's start cleaning up. So they've kind of figured out when that timer is going to go off. So I would say definitely give your child a little bit of a warning for that. But here's why play is so important. So we have something called the continuum of play, and I learned about this at the SREB summer conference. That's the Southern Regional Education Board conference. And the 5 different levels of play are free play, inquiry play, collaborative play, playful learning, and learning through games. And there is not a specific one that researchers say is more important than the other. But it is very important that children, especially children in early childhood, are learning through play. Now, I know I've mentioned this before. Early childhood is defined as anywhere between ages 3 and 8. So 3 would be early preschool, pre-K age, all the way up to 8 years old, which is the first part of 3rd grade. This is important to keep in mind because the attention span of the average 4-year-old is 8 to 12 minutes. And I had to write this down so that I have it. So let me look at my notes while I'm talking to you. The average attention span of a 5 to 6-year-old is 12 to 18 minutes. The average attention span of a 7 to 8-year-old is 16 to 24 minutes. So when you're thinking about that in teaching, or even at home, still teaching, you're sitting down and you're trying to get a kid to do work. If you're trying to get them to do a 20 to 30 minute lesson, it's not appropriate for their development. I'm not saying that you've done anything wrong. You just didn't know, and that's okay. Now that you do know, see if you can change that up a little bit. I know for me personally, I do a lot of my whole group teaching at circle time. I never go beyond 10 minutes at circle time because I know that my children's attention span will not go that long. So what I like to do is I like to break up my circle time so that I have some of it before the students go to breakfast, then some of it right after the students go to breakfast. That's just a schedule that seems to work for me. And that way they are not having to sit through 30 to 35 minutes of circle time. It just breaks it up into smaller chunks, and then the students get everything that I want to teach them, and they're retaining it better because they're not having to sit and get, as a lot of people like to say. So what can play do for a child? It helps with their relationships. and their social emotional development. If you have a group full of children and you are giving them blocks, I always like to use blocks as my scenario, and this, I don't know why, there are so many things that they could share, right? If you only give them a tub of blocks to play with, they have to share, because if one person hoards the blocks, the other kids are just sitting there, right? They have to work together because there are a limited number of blocks, and eventually you're going to run out of blocks. So at some point you're going to have to start working together. They have to build relationships with each other or figure out how to resolve conflict with each other. So all of that is in that social emotional range. Play helps to boost creativity and ingenuity, which seems like a no-brainer for everyone, right? Like, well, yeah, they're playing, so they're being creative. So I know there are different types of pretend play, and I have to judge this each year. There's the early learning reporting system is what it's called. And it says that students use objects for their intended purpose. So like if they have a toy phone, they pretend it's a toy phone, which a lot of students do that, right? But let's say students didn't have a toy phone and instead they had a big wooden block and they wanted to pretend that was a toy phone. You can see how that different pretend play has changed that way, because they have to get really creative in pretending that that wooden block is a phone, right? Gross motor and fine motor skills come out in play. Gross motor skills are those big muscles, so climbing, running, jumping. I know you can't always do all of those inside, I get that, but whenever you take your students out to the playground or to the gymnasium, or to the park if you're a parent at home, they're getting that gross motor skill. They're running, they're jumping, they're climbing, they're throwing a ball, they're kicking, I don't know what I was going to say right there, but they're working on those muscles. And that is really important at this age, because they're learning things like balance and spatial awareness that fall under gross motor. For fine motor skills, that's more like whenever they're sitting down and playing with those little tiny toys. I'm looking over at my daughter's toys thinking about some of those. They're just really little, and they have to use those tiny little fingers to make tiny little movements and build with those. For academics, I could go on and on about this part. This is where my wheelhouse really is. So I wrote in my notes, explain hair salon. So let me explain that. So whenever I was teaching out in the county a few years ago, my students were using the kitchen, the pretend kitchen sink, as if they were in a hair salon, and they were pretending to wash each other's hair in the sink, and then they were using their fingers to pretend to cut the hair. So what I did is I took what they were interested in and I created a hair salon for them, right? So what I did, I asked them what they saw in a hair salon, and I gathered up all these materials. It took a long time, oh yes. I didn't use real scissors, don't be afraid. I used plastic Play-Doh scissors, and I got one of those mannequin doll heads. It's only like $15 on Amazon. You can actually find them cheaper than what I thought you could. Also, it's a great way to scare your janitor in the evening. So they were able to practice doing hair on the doll, so that nobody's hair was getting yanked out or knotted up or whatever, because I know parents would not like that. And then they could pretend with each other a little bit as well. Something else that I had them do, though, we caught a hairstylist to come in who was just absolutely amazing with the kids. I couldn't have asked for someone better to come in. But she came and she showed the kids how she put a curler in a hair. She showed the kids clippers for boys, and she was making the sound with it. She showed how she could mix up hair dye. She really went in depth, and the kids were loving it. They had a list of questions pre-made And so they were able to ask her these questions. And then as they were asking those questions and getting answers, that obviously led to new questions. So they were really studying about this hair salon, right? Then they got to make they make different signs rather, and it showed different services, and they determined how much money it would cost for each of those services. And they got to write the numbers down to say, okay, this is $5 or this is $7. And I know that those are not necessarily realistic numbers, but we're going to go with it because they're in pre-K and those are numbers that they can write, and that's wonderful. I also let them use encoding to write some of the words. So scissors, that's kind of a hard word, but like I know that one kid wrote it SISRS. I accept that, right? Because they are saying what they hear, and those are the sounds they are hearing, so I will take that any day. That's called orthographic mapping. I'm trying to think what else with that. There was a lot to it, but we really did go into depth with that, and you can do that in your classroom with just about anything. You can do it at home with just about anything too. All you have to do is know what your students are interested in or your child is interested in, and then get a little creative with making up a little area for that for a little while. That didn't last very long. It was like a month to 6 weeks that we had it like that, and then we moved on to another topic. Let's see. In my classroom, I have different stations set up. I've got 5 different stations. In the block station, right now, because it's the beginning of the school year, I have an I can statement above each one. In the blocks, it says I can share, because again, I don't put a whole lot out of blocks, and that's very purposeful. In the pretend center, I have the words I can clean up correctly. In the art center, I say I can keep markers nice, because they're just learning how to use markers. Some of them maybe haven't ever had markers before, or they need to learn that personal responsibility. So I give each kid their own art box, and if they run out of markers, well, you got to use crayons for a little while. We do give them markers back eventually, but we let them run out of them sometimes too, so that they are learning that personal responsibility. In table toys, my I can statement currently is I can match shapes, colors, and numbers, and I can use my fingers, because that, again, you're using those little fine motor skills over at table toys. Those are tiny toys. In the library, I have 2 subsections of library. For the books, I said that they can turn 1 page at a time, because a lot of kids want to like grab a bunch of pages and turn them. So let's start at the very beginning. Let's practice turning 1 page at a time in sequential order. And in the writing portion of the library, I say that they can hold a writing utensil correctly. Now, I say these out loud to my students, and I don't expect them to remember all of it. However, I have my aide in the classroom, and I have a couple of one-on-one aides in the classroom. And whenever I say one-on-one, I just mean they have individual attention given to them throughout the day. But they are in there, and that way, if they're ever in a center, they can say, hey, tell me how you shared today, or show me how you can clean up and put things back where the labels are. Or how did Mrs. Carly say to put the lid on the marker? Oh, that's right, you snap your cap. So they can really start getting used to that. I know in 2 other videos that I did, I talked about games and I talked about block play. I strongly recommend you going back and looking at those videos, because they are great for this. And I think that's about everything. So my final thing that I'd like to say is that learning through play allows for continuously changing engagement by its nature, because of students' curiosity and the way that students play. It may be on one subject and they skip to another one. So they're able to keep going, and they're able to keep getting into those academics. So that is all I have for you today, and I thank you so much for tuning in. I know this was a bit of a long video, but I appreciate you watching it all. Thank you much, and have a good night.